now ask you to stand as you are able for the reading of a Gospel, Mark chapter 8. Then he, Jesus, began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Praise God for the hearing of these sacred words. Thanks be to God. You may be seated.
Well, again, good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you today on this second Sunday of Lent. We're continuing our sermon series. As you can see, snakes, serpents, and other stuff. We're facing the fearful events of our lives and this world. It's an unprecedented sermon series for an unprecedented time. And so as we get started, let's begin with a moment of prayer. Would you pray with me? God of love and grace and comfort, God of challenge and power, I pray that you would take the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts on this day and work in such a way that they would be made to be acceptable in your sight. I ask this in the name of Christ, who is our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. It began with a text message. One of the members of our ministry team, our children's ministry team, texted me and they said, "Pastor Andy, what are you preaching on this Sunday?" I responded with a laughing emoji. And then this person responded to me, "What's so funny?" And it was then that I texted her back and I explained, sermon title for Sunday, Satan. You can laugh, it's okay. My hunch is you've probably never heard a sermon on Satan very often. And the truth of the matter is, I cannot ever remember preaching a sermon on Satan. We as mainline Protestants like to focus on God's love and God's forgiveness. Things like Satan, the demonic and evil, make us squirm within our seats. And so, well, people like me like to avoid the subject altogether. And yet here we are, snakes, serpents, and other stuff facing the fearful events of our lives. And I can think of no other fearful entity or personality than Satan. And the truth of the matter is, we don't all respond to this subject in the same way. There's one camp of folks that I think give Satan too much power within Christianity. They act as if Satan is around every corner and Satan is under every rock and Satan is trying to trip them up constantly and all the time. They talk about Satan almost more than they talk about God. That's one camp within Christianity. Another camp, it seems like, just want to throw Satan and the idea of the demonic and the idea of spiritual forces of wickedness and just throw all that out the window like the baby with the bathwater. This stuff, they say, is silly and superstitious and it no longer impacts us or is relevant to our modern or postmodern context. But my hunch is most of us here today are somewhere in the middle between these two extremes when it comes to this subject. On the one hand, we don't want to give Satan too much power. But on the other hand, we're not quite ready just to throw it out as if it was irrelevant. And the reason is because, well, deep down we've all experienced the forces of darkness within our lives. In this world that is undoubtedly teeming with the love and the glory of God, we have felt that undeniable urge that pulls us against that grain of the goodness and love that God has called us to. We see it both within our lives and we see it in the world around us. And so as we turn to our lesson today, what we find is, I think, a helpful response to this idea of Satan and the demonic and evil. Our lesson, it comes from Mark chapter 8. Mark chapter 8 is a real pivot point in Jesus' ministry. The whole Gospel of Mark is 16 chapters long, and so Mark chapter 8, obviously, is in the middle of the Gospel. And if you like to think about Mark's Gospel as kind of like a peak, this is the peak of the Gospel. Up to this point, Jesus has been ministering in Galilee. That's his home region in the north. Nazareth was in Galilee, Capernaum in Galilee. Galilee is where Jesus did a lot of his early ministry. He ran around, he healed people, cast out demons, forgave people their sins, went against cultural norms, went against religious norms, and he generated quite a following of people in Galilee. But now in Mark chapter 8, he's pivoting. No longer does he tell his disciples, is he going to be doing ministry in Galilee? He's now going to Jerusalem. And he goes on to explain to his disciples that in Jerusalem, he's not going to be wildly successful. Instead, he's going to be rejected and executed, crucified. At which point, as Mark chapter 8 tells the story, Peter, arguably Jesus' best friend, pulls Jesus aside and says, "Really? I mean, messiahs aren't defeated." In the first century context, everyone basically agreed that the Messiah would have two things going on. Number one, they would be anointed with the Spirit of God, and number two, the Messiah would usher in a new era of history for the people of Israel in the world. In other words, messiahs aren't defeated. And so when Jesus starts talking about being defeated in Jerusalem, Peter is just being a good friend. He's pulling Jesus aside and he says, "Really? Defeated? Jerusalem? Executed? No." At which point Jesus responds in a very harsh way, almost a famous line. "Get behind me, Satan. For you have your mind on human things, not on godly things." At which point I became very curious as I read this story. What did Jesus mean when he used that phrase, Satan? And so I pulled out my trusty HarperCollins Bible Dictionary and I looked it up, the word Satan. And here's what I found, that it comes from a Hebrew word which meant adversary. Satan literally means adversary. And I also learned that in the Hebrew Bible, our Old Testament, Satan appears 3 times. Throughout the whole Old Testament, it appears 3 times. Once in Job, the famous story of Job and his suffering. Once in a prophet by the name of Zechariah. And once towards the end of a book that I'm guessing maybe not all of us have read. It's called 1 Chronicles. The first 2 times Satan appears, Job and Zechariah, it's interesting that he's working, of all places, in heaven. He is a part of the heavenly court, and he's presented as sort of like a heavenly prosecutor that is dispatched from God from time to time to test God's faithful people to see if they could cut the mustard and live faithfully. Of course, that's definitely the story of Job. You all know that, I'm guessing, but it's also the story of Zechariah. And then in Chronicles, Satan kind of, entices David to take a census. And we're not really sure if Satan in this moment is an embodied presence or just that urge that we all have to do evil. Here's my point. Throughout the Old Testament, Satan's never really presented as the great enemy of God and leader of demonic forces that we think of today when we hear the term, at least when you talk about the Hebrew Bible. So the question became next for me, what happened? And here's the answer I found. The people of Israel lost everything. They were defeated by a foreign power, drug away from their homeland, forced to become slaves. At which point they had to decide, who are we going to get mad at? Some people got mad at God. I mean, how could God allow something like that to happen to us? Some people got mad at their leadership. It was the king's fault. It was the leader's fault, the priest's fault. They weren't living faithfully. That's why this calamity came upon us. And some people got mad at Satan. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and what do we have by the time of Jesus? Well, Satan and the demonic is being used to explain just about every difficulty or illness or something that goes wrong in a person's life. And before we just dismiss all of this as some sort of superstitious silliness, friends, we at least have to ask the question, how are we going to explain the evil in our world today? That's not an easy question, is it? And as I look at the Hebrew people and their story, it seems to me we're not all that different than they are. When we look out at the world today and we see the evil, some of us blame the leaders. It's the leader's fault. That's why it's all wrong. Some of us blame God, though we would not a lot of times say that out loud. But deep down in our soul and our spirit, we say, well, how can God allow this to happen? Some of us blame the devil, and still others of us even blame ourselves. Maybe that's the most popular answer when it comes to evil. It's our fault. When I talk about Satan and the demonic or evil, not that I talk about that often with people, this is the only sermon I've ever preached on the subject. Most of the time, though, it's our fault. Human choice, that explains the evil. And I think it explains a lot of it. I do. Historically, theologians have three categories when it comes to evil. There's individual evil, where we make poor decisions. There's societal and cultural evil, where we kind of get stuck in a rut and get caught in certain patterns like racism and greed, sexism. But then there's natural evil. They call it natural evil. When life conflicts with life. That's the one that's hard to explain. Why cancer? Why did that child die? Why do we know the right thing to do and yet we don't do it? What's this urge? And the truth of the matter is, I have no answer for you. No clear answer. But what I do have for you today is a response. And here's the response I think the gospel calls us to. Without denying the reality of evil in the world today, here's the response. The best critique of the bad is to practice the better together. Let me say that again. The best critique of the bad is to practice the better together. I take this from all people. Jesus. Back to our lesson today, just after he told Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." It's curious, at the very next verse it says, Jesus calls the crowd and the disciples together, and he tells them, whoever wants to follow me must deny themselves and take up their cross and come after and follow me. Now, here's the thing. I've heard a lot of sermons on denying ourselves, especially during Lent. That's a popular topic. I've heard a lot of sermons on taking up our cross. But I can't say I've ever heard a sermon on that first part, where it says he called the crowd together. We don't do it alone. We do it as a community. We practice the better together. And the word that we have for that today is church. It is here, a part of a community like this, that in the midst of all our diversity and all our personalities and all our differences, we come together and we form a, best way I could describe it, like a mosaic of the face of God and the love of God out to the world. conversation that comes to my mind happened just not too long ago with a friend of mine from this church. We were talking about this church, and she said to me, you know, Andy, being a part of this church, it truly makes me a better person. Being a part of this church week after week invites me and challenges me to be the best version of myself. How would your life be different if it wasn't for church? I know as I think about my life, my hunch is I wouldn't be standing here if it wasn't for church. Chances are I probably wouldn't even be alive if it wasn't for church. As I think about church, I think about all the people that I've gotten to meet that I never would have met before. As I think about church, I think about how consistently this place challenges me to use my talents and my gifts and give them away to people that I otherwise would not even thought about giving them away to. As I think about church, I think about that I'm reminded of the thing that's most real about this world always, the eternal love of God. And while I will admit that there are some scary things in this world, there's evil in this world, there's stuff that happens I can't explain in this world, I do believe this much. This place called church is the best option I've discovered to live the better together. And so as we move ahead in the series, Snakes, Serpents, and Other Stuff, Facing the Fearful Events of Our Lives, we're going to continue to talk about some bad stuff. We have to from time to time. But know this much. The best critique of the bad is to always practice the better. And that's always done together through a community. We call it